The Case of Frank Hampden by E. F. Benson. The Case of Frank Hampden. There was a light visible from the chinks and crevices of drawn curtains in the window of Dr. Rupert's study as I passed it on my way back from dinner one night. He lived some 6 doors farther up the same street as I, and since it had long been a frequent custom for us to smoke the go-to-bed cigarette together, I rang and asked if he was at leisure. His servant told me that he had already sent a message across to my house, asking me to look in on him if I got home while the evening was not too far advanced for a casual conversational quarter of an hour. And accordingly, I took off my coat and went straight into the pleasant little front room, about which hung the studious fragrance of the books that lined it from floor to ceiling. Arthur Rupert was not alone this evening. There was, sitting on the near side of the fire, which sparkled prosperously in this clear night of early December frost, a young man whom I was sure I had never seen before. As I entered, he stopped in the middle of a sentence, turning towards the door, and I looked on the most handsome and diabolical face that I had ever beheld. Simultaneously, Rupert got up. "I hoped you would look in," he said. "Let me introduce you to my cousin, Mr. Hampden, who is spending a day or two with me. This is Mr. Archdale, Frank, of whom I was speaking just now." As the other rose, I saw that Rupert's almost foolishly amiable fox terrier shrank away from where she had been sitting by her master's chair, instead of giving me her accustomed and effusive greeting, and retreated into a far corner of the room, where she sat quivering with raised hackles, and with vigilant eyes full of hate and terror fixed on young Hampden. His right arm was in a sling, and he held out his left hand to me. "You must excuse me," he said, "but I am only just recovering from a broken arm. My cousin's dog doesn't approve of it. She would like to get her teeth into it." "The oddest thing I ever saw, Archdale," said Rupert. "You know Fifi's usual amiability. Call her Frank." Frank Hampden whistled and clicked his fingers together in an encouraging manner. "Fifi, come here, Fifi," he said. For a moment I thought that this most confiding of ladies was going to fly at him, but apparently she could not find the courage for an attack, and snapping and growling, retreated behind the window curtains. "And that to me," said Hampden, licking his lips as he spoke. "Me, who adore dogs. Don't you, Mr. Archdale?" As he said that, I knew that he lied, that Fifi's detestation of him was met with a hatred quite as vivid, but more controlled. I can no more account for that conviction than for the sense of hellish evil that my first glance at him had conveyed to me. He was quite young, 22 or 23 for a guess, and yet from behind the mask of that soft boyish face there looked out a spirit, hard and malignant and mature, an adept in terrible paths. The impression was quite inexplicable, but perfectly clear. Then, looking across to Rupert, I saw he was watching his cousin with eager intentness. I had to answer the direct question he had put to me, but it required an effort to speak to him, or to look at him. "No, personally I don't care for dogs," I said. "I rather dislike them, and so enjoy a most unwelcome popularity among them. Fifi, for instance, your cousin will tell you how blind is her adoration for me." "See if Fifi will come to you if I stand by you," said Hampden. Fifi had half emerged from her ambush behind the curtains, and I called to her, but she would not leave the retreat where her rage and terror had driven her. She gave a little apologetic whine, as if to signify that I was asking an impossible thing, and beat with her stumpy tail on the carpet. "Now go back to your chair again, Frank," said Rupert. Fifi needed no further invitation when he had left my neighbourhood. She bundled herself across the room to me, her thin white body curled like a comma, wriggling with delight and making incomprehensible little explanations of her previous conduct. But the moment that Hampden moved in his chair, she bolted away from me again. He laughed and got up. "Well, I think I shall go to bed, now that you have come to keep Arthur company," he said. "By the way, where's your cat, Arthur? I haven't seen her about all day." He was facing sideways to Rupert as he spoke, and I noticed that he did not turn his head towards him. This gave a certain casual, cursory tone to his question, making it appear a mere careless inquiry. "I haven't seen her either," said Rupert. "Perhaps, after taking counsel with Fifi, she has thought it prudent to fly from your baleful presence. Good night, Frank. Can you manage for yourself with your bandaged arm, or shall I come and help you?" "Oh, I'm all right, thanks," he said. "Good night. A kind good night, Fifi. We shall be good friends before long." Arthur Rupert had retired some 2 years before from regular medical practice, in which, as all the world knows, he was undoubtedly the first authority on disease and aberrations of the brain and nervous system, devoting his attention more particularly to those riddles of obscure and baffling disorders to which he so often supplied strange and correct answers. He was possessed of an ample competence, and so, finding that his large professional practice did not permit him the leisure which was necessary for these exploratory studies, he had, though always willing to be consulted by his colleagues, thrown up an active career for one of research. He wanted to learn rather than to practice, and without precisely mistrusting the methods which had earned him so brilliant a success, had inferred the presence of huge fields of the unknown, huge expanses of further possibilities, which would perhaps put utterly out of date the most advanced of theories and treatments hitherto recognized in his profession. At the time of his retirement, he had once talked to me about the uncharted seas onto which he proposed to push forth. "The most advanced of actual practitioners," he said, "are but groping in the dark on the threshold of real knowledge, feeling for the handle, fumbling for the bell. At the most, that is to say, in cases of brain disease and nerve disorder, we try to get at the mind of the patient and influence that, so that it, not we, may exert its healing power and cure the imperfect functioning of the material part. Of course, that is a tremendous step forward when we look at what medical science was 20 years ago, when doctors prescribed tonics to heal the physical damage caused by a disordered mind. But mind itself is but a very subordinate denizen in that house of mystery which we call man. Mind is no more than the servant who comes to the door and takes your hat and coat and tells you in a word or two how the patient has been. Mind is not the master of the house, whom you have really come to see, and who sits there alone, mortally sick perhaps, and in terror and darkness, for the master of the house is the spirit. We have got to examine him before we can touch the source of these diseases, for the farther that science advances, the more certain it is that there is a master sitting within to whom the mind is only the servant. As for the body, the tissues, the nerves, the grey matter, what shall we say that is? Why, it's no more than the servant's clothes, his jacket or his boots. I'm not going to stay talking in the hall to mind the servant any longer. I shall leave him there, and go straight up to the sick chamber. I shall be called all sorts of names, charlatan, spiritualist, what you will, but I don't care 2 straws about that. Besides, I know quite well that my colleagues will still be glad to call me in when they are puzzled, and I hope to be better equipped to help them. I won't reject any jungle path without exploring it. Not witchcraft, nor demoniacal possession, nor all the myths which science thinks she has exploded. In its first origin everything must be spiritual, be it comet or toothache or genius. Just as mental suggestion has taken the place of tonics, so must spiritual healing take the place of mental suggestion. The Spirit is the original manifestation of God in man, and it is on prayer and on faith that the whole science of healing will some day rest. But first, we have to investigate the conditions, the environment, the life. For these 2 years, then, which had followed his retirement, Rupert had given himself to these studies of occult and spiritual influences, learning about the healing powers contained in mental suggestion, and trying to get behind that into the more elemental and essential mysteries of man, leaving the servant, as he had said, in the hall of the house, while he went further into the presence of the master of the house. Often, during these go-to-bed cigarettes that multiplied themselves into the night, he told me tales that did not make going to sleep any easier. Nothing was too extravagant for his investigations. Witchcraft, spiritualism, Satanism, the healing touch, and above all, demoniacal possession were the subjects of this study that went deeper into the human organism than mind. There was no myth or exploded superstition that he did not examine, to see whether the explosion had been complete and shattering, or whether among the debris there did not remain some grains of solid stuff that were still solid, though science had affirmed that a puff of scattered smoke was all that was extant. Consequently, this evening, when Frank Hampden had gone to bed, I was quite prepared to find that Rupert had something to tell, some guess to hazard that had illumined his inquiries, the more so indeed because I had not seen him for some dozen nights. "Did you receive the message I left at your house?" he asked abruptly, as the door closed behind his cousin. "No, I haven't been home, but your servant told me you had asked me to come in," said I. "Yes, I did. You have done just what I wanted. In my note I asked you to come in and observe my cousin, and tell me your impression. I saw you couldn't help observing him, so now let us have the impression." "Quite frankly, all?" I said. "Of course." "I never saw anyone so utterly terrible," I said. "Terrible? Exactly how?" he asked. The very intensity of my feeling about Hampden blurred the outline of it, and I paused, trying to put a definite shape to it. "Incomparably terrible," I said. "Murderous, I think. Murderous for the fun of it. I felt like Fifi." "I saw you did," he said, "and I suspect you are right, you and Fifi." He walked up and down the room once or twice, then sat down with the air of settling himself. "Did you hear him ask about my cat?" he said. "He killed her last night. He buried her in the garden." There was a grotesqueness, a ludicrousness even in this, after the talk of murder, but that only added horror to it. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Precisely what I say. It so happened that I slept very badly last night, because, as a matter of fact, I was thinking about Frank, and wondering if I was on the horrible track which would show me what ailed him. About 3 in the morning I heard the door into the garden being opened. The window of my bedroom, which was open, is just above it. The idea of burglars occurred to me, and, without turning on my light, I went and looked out. There was bright, clear starlight, and I saw Frank come out of the house, carrying something white in his arm. He put it down to fetch a spade from the tool-house, and I saw what it was. He dug up a couple of plants with lumps of soil round their roots, working slowly, for he could only use one arm. He buried the cat in the excavation, and very carefully replanted the Michaelmas daisies over it. Then, more terribly yet, he knelt down by the grave, and I could hear him sobbing." "Sobbing?" I asked. "Yes. What he said tonight is, or was perfectly true. He used to be devoted to dogs, and indeed all animals, especially cats. Now, last night, out in the garden, he was in his dressing gown. When he came down to breakfast this morning, he said his nose had been bleeding rather severely. He was uneasy about it, and I went up to his bedroom and found a good deal of blood in his slop pail. His dressing gown was lying on his bed, and there, too, was more blood, and a quantity of cat's hairs. I told him not to think about it any more. There was nothing in the least alarming, and when he had gone out, in order to make quite sure, I dug up the Michaelmas daisies for the second time. Below, I found the body of my poor cat. He had cut its throat. He would kill Fifi if he could. He is longing to. "But the fellow is a fiend," said I. "For the present he is a fiend, or something very like it. He used not to be until the day on which he broke his arm. Pray God he will cease being what he is." "Till the day he broke his arm?" I asked. "Yes. Now, do you want to hear the wildest and most extravagant tale, which I believe to be literally and awfully true?" "Concerning this?" I asked. "Of course. Also, are you disposed to sit up late tonight? There may be some confirmatory evidence about my story. I expect Reed, the medium, here at 12. There is time for me to give you my theory before he comes." "Tell any hour," said I. "Good. Then listen." He spoke slowly, putting his hands over his eyes, as he so often does when he wants to shut out all external disturbances and concentrate himself on the history of a case. "2 months ago," he said, "as you may possibly remember, a man called James Rolls was hanged at Beltonborough for the most atrocious murder of his wife. The deed apparently was quite objectless. There had been no quarrel, and after it was done, he seemed sometimes to be distressed at the crime, sobbing and crying, sometimes to gloat over it, recounting it with gusto. There was no question whatever about his guilt, only about his sanity, and with regard to that, these fits of remorse and enjoyment might be assumed in order to produce the impression that he was not accountable for his actions. He was examined by a government expert, who asked me to come down with him and form my conclusion. We could neither of us find any other symptom of insanity about him, but there was a certain conjecture in my head about what he called the history of the case, and I stopped down at Beltonborough for a day or two in order to make further observations. As I was having an interview with him, I suddenly asked him this question: "Did you begin by killing flies?" Usually he was rather sullen and silent, and often would not answer. But when I asked him this, his eye brightened, and he said, "Yes, flies first, and then cats and dogs." After that I could get nothing further out of him, but I had got what I was expected to get. In all other respects he was, as far as I could judge, perfectly sane, and it was scarcely possible to call him a homicidal maniac, for he had never before shown signs of wanting to take human life. As it was, he had committed an atrocious murder, and had he been shut up as a homicidal maniac, I do not think there is any doubt that by this time he would have killed a warder. Now, no man in a fit of rage is altogether sane, and yet we do not commute the sentence of those who have killed another when beside themselves with passion, and James Rolls had not even that extenuation. He was hanged. But I feel convinced that Frank is suffering from an early stage of James Rolls's malady. I feel convinced also that the hanging of James Rolls infected him with it. "The hanging of James Rolls caused it?" I asked. "I do not doubt it, as you will see when I state my theory. But I hope to prove that my theory is correct, and I hope to cure my cousin." Rupert sat up and looked at me while he said this. Then he sank back in his chair again, and as before covered his eyes with his hands. "Now for the theory," he said. "There is a very steep hill in Belton Borough, with a sharp, dangerous corner just outside the prison gate. Practically at the moment when James Rolls was being taken to the scaffold, Frank came tearing down this hill on his bicycle to catch an early train to town. He skidded and fell just outside the prison, and sustained compound fracture of his right arm. It was important that he should be moved as little as possible, and they carried him straight into the prison infirmary, where chloroform was administered, and the prison surgeon set his arm. It was a very bad fracture, and he was under the anaesthetic for a considerable time. And when he came round, he was changed. It seemed as if another spirit had taken possession of his body. He was not the same person. From being a charming boy, he had become something hellish." Rupert sat up again and looked at me. "There is a theory," he said, "that in certain conditions, such as deep mesmeric trance, or under the stupefaction of some complete anaesthetic, the bonds that seem so indissolubly to unite a man's spirit to his mind and his body are strangely loosened. The condition approaches to that of temporary death. Often under an anaesthetic the beat of the heart is nearly suspended. Often the breathing is nearly suspended. And this happened to Frank under chloroform that morning. The connection between his spirit and his body was loosened." "There is another theory, which you must consider also. It is proved, I think, beyond all doubt, that at the moment of death, particularly of sudden and violent death, the spirit, though severed from the body which it has inhabited, does not at once leave its vicinity, but remains hovering near to its discarded tenement, from which it has been expelled. Well, at that hour when Frank's spirit was maintaining but a relaxed hold on his body, another spirit, violent and strong, was close at hand, a spirit that had just been disembodied, and I believe the spirit of James Rolls entered and took possession. I felt then what I have felt before and since, namely, some stir of horror in my head that made my hair move. You can often see it in dogs. I had seen it tonight in Fifi, when terror or rage erects their hackles. But the experience was only momentary, and the flame of this thing, its awful and burning quality, licked hotly round me. "And how is Reed to help?" I asked. "He may be able to test for us part, at any rate, of my theory," said Rupert. "He is an extraordinarily powerful medium in the way of producing materialized forms of spirits, and I believe him to be honest and high-minded. Now, if Frank's body is possessed by this murderous spirit, it is at least possible that Frank's own spirit, now unhoused and evicted, will be hovering near its rightful habitation. We will ask if the spirit of Frank Hampden is here. We will ask if it can assume material form. If Reed can produce this materialization, it will doubtless wear the appearance of Frank. We will try, anyhow. Ah, no doubt that is Reed." A very gentle tapping sounded on the front door just outside the room, and Rupert got up. "I told Reed not to ring," he said, "for fear that Frank should hear. I will let him in." He left the room, and in another moment came back with the medium, a small, perfectly commonplace-looking man, smug and prosperous. Then I met his eyes and thought him commonplace no longer. They seemed to look out and through and beyond. In a few minutes Rupert, who had often sat with Reed before, explained what was wanted. He told him that he wished to know if the spirit of Frank Hampden was about, and if so, whether we could communicate with it or see it. That was all. Reed asked only one question. "Has Frank Hampden's spirit been long out of his body?" he said. Rupert hesitated for a moment. "I believe it to have been out of his body for about 2 months," he answered. The electric light was put out, but the glow from the fire was bright enough to make a red twilight in the room. I could clearly see the profile of the medium, black against that illumination, the back of the chair in which he sat, the full face of Rupert, glints of reflected light on the glass of pictures, and, with perfect distinctness, Fifi, who had curled herself up on the hearth-rug. Almost immediately the medium went into trance, and I saw his head bowed over his chest, and heard his breathing, which had been short and panting as he passed into unconsciousness, grow quiet again. How long we sat there in silence, without anything supernormal occurring, I do not know, but it appeared to me not to be many minutes before a very loud rap sounded from the table, which began to quiver under our hands. Then Rupert asked, "Is the spirit of Frank Hampden here?" There was the assent of 3 raps. "Shall we be able to see you?" he asked. There were 2 raps, and after a pause, a third. Again we sat in silence, this time for a much longer period, and I think the clock on the mantelpiece twice chimed the quarter hour. Then, from the direction of the door, there blew across the room a very cold current of air, and the curtains in the windows stirred with it. Fifi, I imagine, felt it too, for she sat up, sneezed, and drew herself a little nearer to the fire. Simultaneously I was inwardly aware that there was somebody, in the room which had not been there before. It had not entered through the door, for when the current of the air began to blow, I looked at it, and certainly it had not opened. Then Rupert whispered, "Look, it is coming." The medium's head had fallen back, and over his chest, in the region of the heart, there appeared a faint, luminous area, inside which there was going on some energy, some activity, whirls and spirals of grey, curling and intertwining and growing thicker and extending, began building themselves up in the air. For some little while I could not make out what it was that was thus taking shape in the red twilight. Then, as the materialization progressed, it defined itself into a human form swathed in some misty and opaque vesture. At the top, above shoulders now quite formed, there rose the outline of a head, features growing every moment more distinct, fashioned the face of it, and pallid and silent, fading into darkness below, stood the head and torso of a human being. The face was clearly recognizable. It was scarce an hour since I had looked on those features, but it wore so heartbroken an anguish in the curves of that beautiful mouth and in the tortured eyes that my throat worked for very pity and compassion. Then Rupert spoke. "Frank," he said. The head bowed, the lips moved, but I heard nothing. "Why are you not in your body?" he asked. This time there came a whisper, just audible. I can't, he said. "Someone is there, someone terrible. For God's sake, help me." The white, agonized face grew more convulsed. "I can't bear it," it said. For God's sake, for God's sake." I looked away from that face for a moment to the hearth-rug, where a sudden noise attracted my attention. Fifi was sitting bolt upright, looking eagerly upwards, and the noise I heard was the pleased thumping of her tail. Then she came cautiously forward, still gazing at the image which an hour before had driven her frenzied with rage and terror, uttering little anxious whinings, seeking attention. Finally she held out a paw, and gave the short whisper of a bark with which she demands the notice of her favourites. and if I had been inclined to doubt before, I think that I would now have been convinced that here in some inscrutable manifestation was the true Frank Hampden. Once more Rupert spoke. "I will do all that man can do, Frank," he said, "and by God's grace we will restore you." The figure slowly faded. Some of it seemed withdrawn back into the medium, some to be dispersed in the dusk. Before long Reed's breath again grew quick and laboured as he passed out of trance, and then, drenched with sweat, he came to himself. Rupert told him that the séance had been successful, and then, turning on the light again, we all sat still while the medium recovered from his exhaustion. Before he left, Rupert engaged him to hold himself in readiness for a further séance next day, in case he was telephoned for, and when he had gone, we drew up our chairs to the fire, while Fifi went nosing about the room as if searching for traces of a friend. For a long time Rupert sat in silence, frowning heavily at the fire, asking me some question from time to time, to satisfy himself that our impressions had been identical. Then he appeared to make up his mind. "I shall do it," he said. "At least, I shall make the attempt. That was Frank whom we saw just now. Up to that point my theory is confirmed. Of course there's a risk. There's an awful risk. But, Archdale, wouldn't anybody take any risk to cure the anguish we looked upon? That was a human spirit, man, disembodied but not dead, and it knows that its earthly habitation is being defiled and profaned by that murderous occupant. It sees the horrors that its own hands work. The brain that was its pleasant servant is planning worse things yet. I can't doubt that this is so. No reasonable man can doubt so incredible and so damnable a thing. But if the struggle that there must be is too much for the body that we seek to free, good Lord, what a tale for a coroner's inquest." "You mean that you risk your cousin's death?" I asked. "Necessarily. Who can tell what will happen? But that is not all. For of what nature is the spirit which we hope to expel from that poor lad's body? A strong and a desperate one, or it could never have taken possession of it. It will cling with all its force to the tenement which it has usurped, and if we drive it out, if God helps us to do that, what awful and evil power will once more be abroad? But we can't help that. There is holy justice and reparation to be done, and we can't count the cost. Now, let me think again." He got up and began pacing up and down the room, now muttering to himself, now speaking aloud as if in argument with me. "It's a terrible risk for Reed, too," he said, "for Reed most of all, for he will be in deep trance. Such power of faith as we can exert must defend him first of all. Yet we can't get at Rolls, I tell you, without the medium. I must, of course, tell Reed everything, and ask him if he will take the risk. He may refuse, though I don't think he will, for there's the courage of a saint in that man. Then there's Frank's body, I mean. That must be absolutely unconscious when the operation takes place. No human nerves could stand it, nor with that fiend in possession would he consent to it. Deep, the deepest possible unconsciousness. By Jove, there's that new German drug, which appears safe enough, and it certainly produces a sleep that comes nearest of all to death. It seems to stupefy the very spirit itself. Hyocampine, of course. Don't tell me you haven't heard of it. Tasteless, too. It's a good thing that the criminal classes can't get hold of it. Well, there we are. Prayer and faith in an almighty power. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord. He does, too, if our motives are right. That's one of the few facts we can be sure about. You can run a lot of risks if you utterly believe that." Suddenly the whole burden of perplexity and anxious thought seemed lifted off his mind. "I'll go and see Reed tomorrow morning," he said. "I believe he will consent when he knows all. And you? Do you want to see the end of it, and look on the glory of God? Come if you like, but if you come, you must be strung up to the highest pitch of trust and serenity that you are capable of. Yes, do be here. You believe that all evil, however deadly and powerful, is altogether inferior in caliber and fighting power to good. Also, I shall like a friend at my elbow. Perhaps I oughtn't to urge that as a reason, for I don't want any personal feeling to influence you. Only come if you want to witness the power of God. Not Reed's, not mine. We are nothing at all, except mere mossy channels." For one moment he paused, and I knew that he was wavering himself, in the weakness of the flesh, but instantly he got hold of himself again. "There's only one power that can't fail," he said. "Hell crashes into fragments against it." Next morning I got a note from Rupert, saying that Reed consented, and asking me to come into his house punctually at 2:30, if I had decided to be with him. When I arrived, I found Rupert and Frank Hampden sitting over their coffee in the study. Hampden had just drunk his. "Isn't there a home for cats somewhere in Battersea?" he was asking. "I'll go and find a new one for you, as yours appears to have vanished entirely." He yawned. "It's a feeble habit to go to sleep after lunch," he said, "but I really think I shall have a nap. I've got an astonishing inclination that way. Give me half an hour, will you? And then we'll go down to the cat's home and get a large fat cat." I guessed that Rupert had already given his cousin the dose of hyocampine, and just as the latter was pulling a chair round so that he need not face the light, he spoke. "Make a proper job of it, Frank," he said, "and lie on the sofa. One always wakes feeling cramped if one goes to sleep in a chair." Hampden's eyelids were already drooping, but he shuffled heavily across to the sofa. "All right," he mumbled. "Sorry for being so rude, Mr. Archdale, but I must have just 40. I wonder why 40?" And immediately he went to sleep. Rupert waited a moment, but Hampden did not stir again. Then he went out and returned with Reed, who had been waiting in his bedroom. All explanations had already been made, and in silence we darkened the room by drawing the thick curtains across the window. Only a little light came in from their edges, but as last night, the firelight flickered on the walls. Then Rupert locked the door, and we took our places round the table. "Into thy hands, O Lord, we commend our spirits," he said. Before many minutes were over, the medium's head dropped forward, and after a little struggle he went into trance. "The spirit of James Rolls," said Rupert. In the silence that followed I could hear the slow breathing of Hampden as he slept in that remote unconsciousness. A chink of light from the window fell full on his face, and I could see it very distinctly. Then I heard him breathing quicker, and a shudder passed through him, shaking the sofa where he lay. His face, hitherto serene and quiescent, began to twitch. "He can't wake," whispered Rupert. "I gave him the full dose." Then, not from the door at all, but from the direction of the sofa, there came an icy blast of wind, and simultaneously a shattering rap from the table. "Is that James Rolls?" asked Rupert. 3 raps answered him. "Then in the name of God," said Rupert, in a loud, steady voice, "come from where you are and be made manifest." Suddenly Hampden began to groan. His mouth worked, and he ground his teeth together. A horrible convulsion seized his face, a distortion of rending agony, like that which sometimes seizes on a dying man whose body clings desperately to the spirit that is emerging from it. A rattle and a strangled gulping came from his throat, and the foam gathered on his lips. "It is there that you are, James Rolls," said Rupert, in a loud voice of exultation. "In the name of God, come out!" The convulsions redoubled themselves. The body writhed and bent like that of a poisoned man. Then round the face, brightest about the mouth, there formed a pale greenish light, corrupt and awful. It began to wreathe itself into lines and curves, weaving and intertwining. It grew in height, like a luminous column built without hands in the darkness. It defined itself into human form, until in the air just above the recumbent body it stood complete. With its emergence the convulsions and the groaning subsided, and at the end, when this wraith, in semblance of a swathed man, with face of such murderous cruelty that I shuddered as I looked at it, stood fully fashioned and finished, the body of Frank Hampden lay quite still, in that sleep which was nearest of all to death. Then Rupert's voice spoke again, clear and peremptory and triumphant. "Begone, James Rolls!" he cried. Very slowly the materialized spirit began to move, floating like a balloon in an almost windless air. Slowly it drifted towards us, with its eyes fixed on the unconscious medium and alight with awful purpose, its mouth curled into some sort of hellish smile. It came quite close to him, as if sucked there, and the edge of its outline began to extend towards him a feeler, as of a little whirlpool of water drawn down into a sink, till the end of it just touched him. "In the name of the holiest, and by the power of the highest," shouted Rupert, "I bid you go to the place that he has appointed for you." Then I can only describe what happened by saying that some shock, blinding, deafening, overwhelming every sense, shook the room. It leaped into a blaze of light. A thunder of sound rent the air, and yet I knew that all this came from within, was the echo of the spiritual crisis that raged around us made manifest to the bodily sense, and silence as of the frozen polar night succeeded. Then once again a light began to be built up over Hampden's body that lay utterly still beside the curtains. It fashioned itself, but only very faintly, into the outline of a man, and this seemed to be drawn inwards and absorbed by that motionless figure. We waited till it had disappeared altogether. The medium stirred and struggled. "It is over," he said, and laid his head on his arms. Rupert got up and drew back the curtains. From outside the door came scratchings and whinings, and presently he unlocked it and let Fifi in. She saluted everybody in her exuberant fashion, then came to the sofa, sniffed and jumped up on it, wagging her tail. It was not till late in the afternoon that Frank Hampden came to himself. A beautiful spirit looked out of those jolly boyish eyes. End of section 8.